My father told me I was useless exactly 4 hours after we buried the only person who ever believed in me. The rain hadn't even stopped falling on my grandfather's grave when Sterling Vance decided I'd outlived my purpose in his world. $600 million. That's what my usefulness was worth to him, and the moment it transferred into his name, I became nothing more than furniture to be cleared out before dawn. The rain poured down on Charleston like the sky itself was mourning. St. Jude's Church stood somber against the gray afternoon, its stained glass windows muted by the downpour. Inside, the funeral of Silas Vance, my grandfather, the lighthouse in my otherwise dark childhood, proceeded with cold formality. Rows of polished pews filled with faces I'd seen at countless charity galas and business functions, people who'd come to pay respects to a titan of real estate, not to mourn a man. Sterling Vance, my father, stood near the front, shaking hands and offering that practiced politician's smile he'd perfected over decades of closing deals and crushing competitors. He wore grief like an expensive suit, something put on for the occasion and just as easily removed. I watched him from my seat in the second row, the one reserved for family, though I'd never quite felt I belonged there, and allowed myself a dangerous flicker of hope. Perhaps grief would soften him. Perhaps losing his father would remind him he still had a daughter. That hope died faster than the lilies wilting in the humid church air. The service ended with a hymn I didn't know the words to. People filtered out slowly, umbrellas blooming like dark flowers as they stepped into the rain. I stayed until the church was nearly empty, staring at the mahogany casket that held the only person who'd ever looked at me and seen potential instead of disappointment. Back at the house, the one I'd grown up in but never felt was home, I sat in the living room nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The scent of lilies hung heavy in the air, cloying and oppressive. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, that particular cadence that had made me tense since childhood, the rhythm of authority and expectation. Sterling walked in, and the mask he'd worn at the funeral was gone. His face was bare of pretense, jaw set in that way that meant his mind was made up about something. He didn't sit. He didn't offer condolences for our mutual loss. He simply stood there, hands in his pockets, and delivered the verdict. "It's done," he said, clipped and businesslike. "The estate has been officially transferred. $600 million, all mine." A smile I can only describe as cruel tugged at the corner of his mouth. I nodded slowly, not trusting myself to speak, not sure what there was to say. Sterling didn't give me time to figure it out. "You're useless now. You've been living off the family long enough. Pack your things. I want you out of this house before sunrise." The words hit me like a physical blow, electric and shocking in their cruelty. This was the man who'd taught me to ride a bike in the driveway of this very house, who'd lectured me about ambition and achievement, who now looked at me like I was a piece of furniture that no longer matched the decor. I stood slowly, feeling my chest constrict, my lungs fighting for air that suddenly seemed too thick to breathe. "Fine," I said, and my voice came out colder than I'd expected, steadier. I turned and walked away, my footsteps echoing in the long hallway that led to the bedroom I'd never really made my own. I thought about my childhood as I climbed those stairs. About growing up in a house where silence was a form of control, where my earliest memories of Sterling were corrections and criticisms, a constant litany of ways I wasn't good enough, wasn't what he'd hoped for. My mother had died when I was 6, and after that, it was just Sterling's cold expectations and the crushing weight of never meeting them. Silas had been different. My grandfather had actually listened when I talked about my dreams of understanding finance, of learning how money and power flowed through the world like invisible rivers. When I got accepted into a prestigious graduate program in financial analysis, Sterling had dismissed it as a waste of time and money. Silas had quietly handed me a check large enough to cover the first year's tuition. "Don't tell him," Silas had said, pressing the check into my palm in his study, surrounded by books and the smell of old leather. "This is between us. Consider it an investment in someone worth investing in." That memory burned now as I pulled my suitcase from the closet and began throwing clothes into it without folding them. Worth investing in. The irony was almost funny. Sterling had never seen me as worth anything. The next few days passed in a blur of cold hostility. The warmth that Silas had brought to the mansion evaporated like morning dew. Doors that had always been open were suddenly locked. The library, the sunroom, even the small office where Silas had kept his personal files, all sealed off. The staff, people I'd known for years, avoided eye contact. Clara, the housekeeper who'd snuck me cookies when I was a child, now only offered curt nods. I was packing books when I found it. An old biography Silas had given me for my 18th birthday tumbled from the shelf, and a sealed envelope fell out, my name written in his distinctive handwriting across the front. My hands shook as I tore it open. Inside was a single piece of paper with one sentence: "A will protects those who protect others." No explanation, no context, just those 8 words, heavy with meaning I couldn't yet decipher. I felt electricity run through my body. Silas had hidden this for me to find. This wasn't random. This was intentional. I found myself standing outside Sterling's study later that evening, the note burning a hole in my pocket. I knocked, and his voice called out for me to enter. He sat behind the massive mahogany desk that had been Silas's, leaning back in that leather chair like a king on a throne. "Sit," he said, without looking up from the papers spread before him. I remained standing. He finally glanced up, irritation flickering across his face before he smoothed it away. "I assume you've heard," he began, with that smug satisfaction he could never quite hide when he thought he'd won. 600 million. All mine. Your grandfather was generous." I stayed silent. "You've had a long, comfortable life here, Victoria," he continued, his voice growing colder. "But you're not a child anymore. You're a financial burden. And frankly, you've been living off the family name for far too long." He said it like a judge pronouncing sentence. "I want you gone before dawn. This is my house now, and I decide who belongs here." I felt the weight of the note in my pocket, those words like fire against my skin. "A will protects those who protect others." I straightened my shoulders, meeting his eyes with a steadiness I didn't entirely feel. "Fine," I said. My voice didn't waver. I turned and walked out without another word, closing the door quietly behind me. The next morning, I dragged my suitcase up the narrow stairs of a cramped apartment in downtown Charleston. The building was old, the paint peeling in places, the elevator broken more often than not. But it was mine. I'd sold some jewelry Sterling had given me over the years, pieces I'd never liked anyway, and it was just enough for first and last month's rent. The apartment was small, just a bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living room that could barely fit a couch and a coffee table. But standing in that empty space, I felt something I hadn't felt in Sterling's mansion: possibility. I spent the next 2 days diving into research. Public records, notary files, old newspaper articles about unusual will provisions. I searched for anything that might explain Silas's cryptic message. The words kept echoing in my mind. "A will protects those who protect others." On the 3rd day after moving out, my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Victoria Vance?" The voice was crisp, professional, female. "Yes?" "This is Eliza Thorne. I was your grandfather's attorney." A pause. "We need to talk about his will. It's unconventional." My heart started racing. "Unconventional how?" "Not over the phone. Can you come to my office? Say, tomorrow morning at 10? I agreed, and she gave me an address in the financial district. After I hung up, I sat on my secondhand couch, staring at the phone, Silas's note clutched in my other hand. "A will protects those who protect others." Eliza Thorne's office wasn't what I expected. Instead of dark wood and intimidating law books, it was all clean lines, soft colors, and one wall covered with neatly labeled file folders. She stood when I entered, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a handshake that meant business. "I've been waiting for you to call," she said as I sat across from her desk. "Your grandfather anticipated certain motivations within this family." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean my father?" "Specifically your father," Eliza confirmed, pulling a thick file toward her. "Silas placed his entire estate, all $600 million, into a trust. Sterling can't access a single penny unless specific conditions are met." The room seemed to tilt slightly. "What conditions?" Eliza's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "He has to complete a community redevelopment project that meets city approval and Silas's charitable standards. And he has to do it with you as co-executive director, equal authority, equal signature power." I leaned forward, trying to process what she was saying. "You're telling me he can't do it without me?" "Exactly. There's more," Eliza continued, flipping through the pages. "You have 12 months to complete the project. During that time, there can be no lawsuits between you and Sterling, no public estrangement, and no official withdrawal from the agreement by either party. Any violation, and the trust dissolves." My mind was racing. Dissolves how? Eliza turned to the final page of the terms. "Half the money goes to charities Silas designated, the other half goes directly to you." I sat back, feeling a strange calm settle over me. I thought about Sterling in his study, smug and certain he'd won. I thought about him calling me useless. I thought about being thrown out like trash. Silas really planned this, I murmured. He wanted to ensure the person he trusted most had the position to protect his legacy, Eliza said. And that person wasn't your father. When does Sterling find out? I asked. Eliza's smile widened slightly. He already knows. I felt something shift in my chest, anticipation and cold satisfaction mixing together. Then, I suppose I should expect a knock on my door. It came less than 24 hours later, a sharp, insistent knocking that made my cheap door rattle in its frame. I opened it to find Sterling standing there, dressed impeccably as always, but there was something haggard about him. His face was pale, a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Victoria," he said, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace, "we should talk, family to family." I stepped aside silently, letting him into my cramped living room. He looked around with barely concealed disgust at the secondhand furniture, the peeling paint, the water stain on the ceiling. "The bank informed me there's been a misunderstanding," he began, sitting on my thrift store couch like it might contaminate him. "The funds are tied up in some kind of trust. Quite a paperwork mess." His voice was light, casual, but I could hear the strain underneath. "That's not a misunderstanding," I said. "That's the will." Sterling waved a hand dismissively. "Your grandfather was sentimental. I'm sure we can sort it out." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You and I, we're blood. We've had our differences, but we can come together now. Let's make this work for both of us." I held his gaze. "What exactly are you proposing?" "That you sign whatever needs to be signed so I can move forward. You'll get something out of it, naturally." I kept my face neutral. "That's not how it's written." Sterling's smile thinned. "Victoria, I'm offering you a way to make this painless. You think you can run a multi-million-dollar project without me? You'll sink us both." There was the threat, hidden in the words but clear as day. But I didn't flinch. "If you want the money," I said quietly, "you'll follow the terms. All of them." A muscle in his jaw twitched. He stood abruptly, straightening his jacket. "Think about it," he said, and walked out without looking back. I closed the door and leaned against it, knowing with absolute certainty that he'd return. He had no choice. 2 days later, I had an agreement ready. Eliza had helped me refine it, make it airtight. Sterling would publicly acknowledge me as co-executive director, cover my living expenses for the duration of the project, and transfer 3 specific properties from the estate into my name. No conditions, no reversals. When I slid the document across the conference table at Eliza's office, Sterling's eyes scanned it, then snapped up to meet mine. "You're not serious." "Every word," I said. "The will is holding you hostage. I'm just giving you a way forward." He spent the next week trying to delay, sent pages back with red ink slashing through the margins. Even consulted another lawyer who confirmed what he didn't want to hear. Silas's language was airtight. Without my cooperation, Sterling's $600 million might as well be buried with my grandfather. When he finally came back to Eliza's office, he was quieter, not defeated, not entirely. But there was a weight to his posture, a tightness around his mouth. He picked up the pen, rolled it between his fingers, and signed each page with quick, sharp strokes. Eliza notarized it while I watched, feeling something shift in the universe, some rebalancing of scales that had been tipped against me my whole life. "I hope you know what you're doing, Victoria," Sterling said as he stood to leave. "I do," I replied, tucking the agreement into my folder. We stood there for a moment, the air between us heavy with everything unsaid. He left without shaking my hand, the door closing with a decisive click behind him. For the first time in years, I felt the balance of power shift. The riverfront lot started as nothing but cracked asphalt and weeds. Silas's plan called for something vital: glass walls opening to the harbor, vocational training classrooms, and space for local markets on weekends. From week 1, I immersed myself in every detail. I walked the construction site every morning with the contractors, reviewed invoices every evening, and built relationships with city officials who had the power to approve or deny our permits. Sterling hated it. He showed up late to meetings, proposed budget cuts that ignored both regulations and Silas's vision. Whenever I pushed back, he muttered that I was difficult to work with. But he never tried to cut me out. He couldn't. The will had made sure of that. I learned the rhythms of construction, the language of permits and zoning laws, the delicate dance of keeping a project on schedule and under budget. I was good at it, better than Sterling wanted to admit, better than I'd known I could be. There were moments when the old doubt crept in, when Sterling's criticisms from my childhood echoed in my head. But I pushed through them, reminded myself that Silas had believed in me enough to structure his entire estate around my involvement. By month 6, the foundation was complete. By month 9, the steel frame was rising against the Charleston skyline. City inspectors came and went, approving each phase. Community leaders visited, expressing excitement about the training programs we'd be offering. In the 11th month, Sterling and I stood together on what would become the viewing deck, looking out over the water. The framework was complete, glass being installed, the bones of Silas's vision finally taking shape. "You've handled this better than I expected," Sterling said, the words clipped but sincere. "Better than you hoped," I corrected. He laughed, sharp and bitter. It wasn't trust, it wasn't forgiveness. But it was acknowledgement, however grudging, that I wasn't the burden he'd painted me as. The ribbon cutting drew a crowd. City leaders, reporters, families from the neighborhood all gathered under bright spring sunshine. Sterling stood to my left, hands clasped, professional smile in place. The cameras loved him, but the speeches weren't his. They were Silas's terms, and mine. When my turn came, I stepped to the podium. I spoke about Silas's belief that wealth meant nothing if it didn't lift others up. I thanked the contractors, the volunteers, the community members who'd helped shape this space. I didn't mention Sterling. The applause started slow, then built to something steady and warm. From the corner of my eye, I saw Sterling's face harden, his jaw clench as attention focused on me instead of him. By day's end, the trust conditions were complete. Sterling would have his fortune. I had something different. 3 prime pieces of real estate in my name, and public recognition for bringing Silas's vision to life. As the crowd dispersed, I slipped away quietly. The center stood behind me, alive with voices, exactly as Silas had imagined it. I didn't look back at Sterling. I didn't need to. I'd taken the part of the family legacy worth preserving, and left the rest to the past where it belonged. 3 months after the ribbon cutting, I stood in the empty penthouse of one of the properties now in my name. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Charleston Harbor, the same water visible from the community center. The space was mine to do with as I pleased. No Sterling, no expectations except my own. My phone buzzed with a text from Eliza. "Trust fully dissolved per terms. Your portion deposited. Congratulations." I looked at the number in my bank account. More money than I'd ever imagined having. But it wasn't the money that made me smile. It was what it represented. Proof that Silas had seen me clearly, had understood that I wasn't useless or a burden, that I was capable, strategic, strong. I thought about that rainy day at street. Jude's about Sterling telling me to be gone before dawn. I thought about the fear I'd felt, the old wounds reopening, and then I thought about everything that had happened since. I'd learned that power isn't always about money or control. Sometimes it's about knowing your worth and refusing to accept anything less. Sometimes it's about letting toxic people face the consequences of their choices while you build something better. The community center would serve thousands of people over the years. The properties in my name would generate income, provide security, give me options, and Sterling would have his $600 million, minus what he'd had to concede to get it. But I had something he'd never understand: peace, clarity, freedom from the need for his approval. I opened the windows, letting the harbor breeze flow through the empty penthouse. Below, I could see people walking into the community center, families and students, seekers and builders. Silas's legacy, protected and thriving. I pulled out my phone and composed an email to a women's business group I'd been following. They were looking for mentors, people who understood how to navigate family businesses and toxic dynamics. I typed, "I'd like to volunteer. I have some experience with protecting legacies from those who destroy them." Send. The sun was setting over the harbor, painting the water gold and pink. I stood at the window of my new home, in my new life, and raised a glass of wine to the skyline. "To you, Silas," I whispered, "for seeing what I couldn't see in myself, for protecting the protector." The will had done exactly what he'd intended. It hadn't just distributed wealth. It had distributed power, shifted the balance, ensured that the person who cared about his true legacy had the means to preserve it. Sterling had gotten his money. But I'd gotten something infinitely more valuable, proof that I was never useless, that my worth had never been dependent on his recognition, that I'd been strong enough all along to stand on my own. The phone rang. I glanced at the screen. Sterling. I let it go to voicemail. Whatever he wanted, whatever complaint or criticism or demand he had, it didn't matter anymore. I'd fulfilled the terms of the will. I'd protected Silas's legacy. And in doing so, I'd discovered my own. I deleted the voicemail without listening to it, blocked his number, and turned back to the window. The city spread out before me, full of possibility, full of promise. Somewhere in that sprawl was the community center, Silas's dream made real, helping people build better lives. And here, in this penthouse, was my own dream taking shape. A life built on my terms, measured by my values, free from the weight of toxic expectations. I'd spent 30 years trying to earn Sterling's love, his respect, his acknowledgement. 30 years believing I needed his approval to have value. Silas had known better. He'd known that what I needed wasn't Sterling's blessing, but the power to claim my own worth. The will had been his final gift. Not just money, but liberation. I raised my glass again, this time to my own reflection in the darkening window. To new beginnings, I said. To knowing your worth. To protecting what matters and letting go of what doesn't. The city lights began to twinkle below, and I felt something I'd never quite felt before, complete. Not because I'd defeated Sterling, though there was satisfaction in watching him squirm, but because I'd finally, truly defeated the voice in my head that said I wasn't enough. I was enough. I'd always been enough. And now I had a legacy of my own to build, one that had nothing to do with Sterling Vance and everything to do with the woman Silas had always believed I could become, the woman I'd finally learned to see in myself.